Alrighty, in this video we're going to talk about buffer and ToArray. So buffer is definitely one to be aware of when looking at documentation. There have been some big changes with how buffer is used. So for example, we can see, if we scroll through this, multiple buffer overloads have been split into other individual methods. So the buffer that takes in an observable is now just buffer. Buffer when is the one that takes in a function, and buffer toggle is the one that takes in both a opening and a closing, an opening observable and a closing function. But I just wanted to point that out in case you guys got online and started researching about buffer, and you might see version 4 examples. Just note that it did change. Refer to the migration guide to keep that up to date. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started with buffer. Buffer is really simple. I'm going to go ahead and pull these guys in. So buffer it does exactly what it says it's going to do. So let's look at a couple of them. So I'm going to go ahead and say Rx observable let's play with ranges. So we range from 1 to 100 or 1,000. 100 doesn't matter. And then we do buffer, and there's a couple of overloads. Again, there's buffer count, there's buffer time, buffer when, buffer closing, and so on. Let's look at buffer count first. If I say buffer count of 50, and then subscribe to items, or subscribe to create subscriber items, and hit Control S. So, or maybe we should do 25. So pretty straightforward. Buffer just takes in X amount, buffer count rather, takes in X amount of items and buffers them into a single array and emits that array as a item in the stream. So we see we have 25 items for each of them. I can go ahead and maybe move this to 110, and you'll see what's happening here is the final buffer, when it completes, might not have 25 items in it, but that's the behavior we want. So basically, we're just buffering things into arrays. Very straightforward. We also have buffer time. So let's go ahead and do buffer time. We'll do an interval for this, and we'll do an interval of 500, and we'll say buffer time, and then 2 seconds, and then we'll say subscribe, create subscriber, buffer time. And it should be pretty clear what this is going to do. It's going to go ahead and emit 3 items, and well, 4 items or whatever, because it looks like there might have been a race or something. And it'll emit those 4 items after 2 seconds. So it'll emit all of the items it acquired in 2 seconds. So that's really handy. And again, it emits them as an array. So this is an array of items. Okay, so that's buffer time. Let's implement buffer time differently. Let's do something fun. I'm going to say Rx observable, but I'm going to do interval of 500. But then I'm going to do the buffer. Now, the buffer function takes in an observable, and I'm going to pass in Rx observable dot interval 2 seconds. And then I'll subscribe to create subscription buffer. And what we're going to see here, just give it a sec, we see the exact same behavior. So what's going on here? Well, the buffer, just the normal buffer method, takes in an observable. And every time that observable produces an event, it will cause the buffer to flush. It's simple as that. So for example, you could buffer things up until a user presses a button. And when the user presses that button, all of those things get passed down as an array. We can see an example of that. I can say const stop subject equals new rx.subject. And I can pass in stop subject into buffer. Stop subject. And I can say window.set timeout. And I can say stop subject dot next, and we'll time out on 1 second. So now, I did that again, didn't I? Maybe 1 second. We have a little bit of a race going on here, so I'm going to do 3 seconds. So we wait 3 seconds, and then we get all of the items that were emitted from that source observable. That were collected in 3 seconds. Now, of course, since I'm no longer calling stop subject.next anymore, it's just going to continue to buffer and eventually will run out of memory. So maybe I should, stop that. I'll just make that. So again, buffer, when you pass in a observable, it's just going to wait until that observable produces a result. And you'll notice that I didn't actually pass anything into next. So we basically just pushed undefined onto the stream, but Buffer doesn't care. Buffer just cares that the observable you pass in is going to produce a result. And when it does, that's when it decides to flush. So really straightforward. So we can create with our subject, we can create sort of any sort of thing that we might want to do. As far as using a subject or using another observable. And that observable could be an event or anything like that. Let's look at ToArray. So let's go ahead and save that out and launch that again. So if I did an Rx observable, and actually I'll bring up another example. When we're talking about mapping, where we were talking about mapping and we did our merge map. So remember this thing where we get the tracks from the promise, and then we merge map into Rx observable from. You can think of from as expanding the result of that promise, right? It takes an array and it returns an observable that contains, that will emit each item sequentially. So it kind of expands that array. Well, ToArray does the opposite. So let's go ahead and check that out. Let's do a Rx observable range of, I don't know, 1 and 10. And then let's go ahead and say 2, or let's do a first just a normal subscription. So create subscriber range. All right, what do we expect? Well, we don't expect an error because it's not subscription, it's subscribe. I can English good. Okay. So we get 1, 2, 3, all as individual items. Now, if I said .ToArray, watch what happens. Now I get the opposite. I get a single item that contains an array of all the items that were emitted. Range will collect every single item from the source stream until the source stream terminates. Well, what happens if it never terminates? What happens if I merge in a Rx observable never? Nothing. See? Clean exit. It just went ahead and just died because there was nothing to do. The observable never finished. Remember, the Rx observable never doesn't create an infinite loop. All it does is just doesn't produce the complete event. So because we didn't produce the complete event, we didn't get any items, and ToArray never finished. And since ToArray never finished, never got the complete or we did get items from our observable range, but ToArray never completed. And as a result, it never emitted its buffer. But anyway, ToArray, very, very simple, straightforward. Something that I can see a lot of uses for when we have a stream and we need to turn it all into array. Buffer can be used for the same thing if we're streaming. Right? Buffer does the same thing, but kind of differently, where if we have a streaming observable that always emits something, Buffer will collect the array, then after X amount of whatever criteria, it will release that array. ToArray, however, does not. ToArray wants to collect the whole thing and then emit the whole thing as one element. And that's Buffer and ToArray.